everyone, welcome to Baking with Pikachu. Today we're going to make and decorate a vanilla-flavored yellow cake that looks like a Pokeball. The only reason it's yellow is because the egg yolks give the cake a yellowish color. Well, what are you sitting around for? Let's get started. Mise en place is a French culinary phrase which means putting in place or everything in its place. It's good to have everything ready and within reach. Baking can be confusing enough without having to fumble through cabinets to try to find what you need. So go ahead and get everything in its place where you can easily access it. Always read the recipe carefully in order to make sure that you're completing things in the proper order. You don't want to have your cake batter sitting in a pan and have to wait for the oven to preheat. Also, you can't just throw everything into a bowl and mix it all together. Some things have to be mixed and added separately in order for the cake to cook properly. The first step in our recipe, after preheating the oven to 350, is to put some of our dry ingredients, flour, baking powder, and salt, into a bowl and mix them together. This doesn't take a lot of effort. Just put them in a bowl and mix them all up. Then, just let them sit there for a bit while we move on to the sugar and shortening. Flour itself doesn't contain any gluten. It's a byproduct of mixing flour with moisture. Gluten development is determined by mixing time and the presence of fat in the dough. The longer a dough is mixed before baking, the more time the gluten has to form, and the more rise they'll create. First, don't panic if you don't have shortening. You can use butter or margarine instead, as long as you still use the same amount that the recipe calls for. Mix your sugar and shortening until light, fluffy, and well combined. You might have to scrape the sides of the bowl to make sure that the shortening didn't stick. Sugar affects texture. It keeps baked goods soft and moist. The bond between sugar and water allows it to lock in moisture. It also creates tenderness. Baked goods get their shape and structure from proteins and starches which firm up during baking and transform soupy batters and soft doughs into lofty muffins and well-formed cookies. While the mixer is running on low, add your eggs one at a time. Make sure they're fully incorporated before adding the next one. You can crack your eggs into a bowl if you're worried about getting shell into your cake. Just pour them in carefully because they try to all flop out at one time. And if this happens, you'll have a very soupy cake batter. As eggs cook, they become firm. That firmness helps set the physical structure of baked goods. The yolks contain all the fat in the egg. They add richness. The egg white can aid in leavening since they hold air bubbles. They're the basis of meringues. And if you brush a little beaten egg white onto a flour-based baked good, it'll add attractive shine. After the eggs are all mixed in, start slowly adding the flour and milk into your mix. You want to switch. First a little flour, then milk, and so on. Let it mix for a minute or so, then check the bowl. Scrape as you go along. Make sure you scrape the bottom too because the mixing attachment doesn't hit the bottom of the bowl. Sometimes stuff settles down there. After you've incorporated all the flour and milk, make sure you give the bowl a good scrape with a rubber spatula. This makes sure that anything that's stuck to the sides will be properly incorporated and it won't leave lumps into your cake. You don't want to be enjoying a piece of your hard-earned cake and bite into a flour bubble. Ugh. Always recheck your recipe frequently when baking to make sure that you haven't forgotten to add anything, like I almost did with this vanilla. I suggest if you're having trouble remembering, place your recipe in a slipcover and use a dry erase marker to check off what you've already completed. We have treated our baking molds with canned cooking spray. I use the baking spray, which is a mixture of oil and flour. Be mindful when purchasing, as some brands leave a sticky residue on your molds. Although it won't hurt anything, it takes a lot of elbow grease to remove, if it comes off at all, and it just isn't very pretty to look at. Time to fill our cake pans. I'm using a silicone baking mold, so I put them on a cookie sheet to keep them from flopping everywhere. You only want to fill them about halfway, in order to allow room for the cake to rise. If you fill them all the way, well, you'll have a mess to clean out of your oven. If any other Pikachus out there are watching this, please be mindful of your ears and tail when baking. You don't want to accidentally get burned like I almost did here. It's a good thing my sister was watching me and warned me about it. Otherwise, I could have gotten seriously hurt. While we wait for our cakes to bake, Did you know that the weight of air is something that most cooks seldom think about? As elevation rises, air pressure falls. Low air pressure has two effects on baked goods. They rise more easily, but they lose their moisture faster. Now that our cakes have finished baking, we have to allow them to cool completely. If we tried to decorate them right away, everything would just melt and slide off, or melt and dissolve into the cake, which would make our hard-earned cake a soggy mess. Now that our cakes have cooled, we can begin decorating. I'm going to use a mix of fondant and buttercream frosting, but you can use whatever methods of making your cake pretty that you want. I'll tell you a secret. They'll get eaten. No matter what they look like, they still taste yummy. Let me tell you a little more about fondant. Fondant is a sugary dough that is most often used to give cakes a smooth finish. You still want to put a thin layer of frosting to act as glue to hold your fondant to the cake. One of my friends told me, it's kind of like putting a tablecloth over your cake to hide any flaws. I guess that's kind of true. And here is our finished cake. I used food coloring to turn my buttercream red and some of the fondant black. I forgot to mention that you need to roll your fondant out to about 1/8 of an inch thick. This helps to cover the cake better. I also use a pizza cutter to cut away any excess fondant. That just seems easier to me. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something about baking today.